throughout human history, brilliant minds have tried to build, well, two major philosophical architectures. One designed really to secure the stable state, and one designed to ensure the stable mind.
Right.
Today, we are attempting a pretty massive comparative analysis.
That's right. Yeah, we're diving into a stack of sources that span, the 16th century all the way to the 20th, juxtaposing foundational arguments for political legitimacy, moral obligation, metaphysical reality to...
It's a huge range.
It is. We're looking at thinkers who prioritize power, right? Those who prioritize justice, others focused on tranquility, and then those who radically questioned pretty much everything.
So our sources cover, the brutal pragmatism of Niccolo Machiavelli, the ethical contractarianism of John Rawls, the atomic naturalism of Epicurus, David Hume's deep skepticism, all the way up through the necessary truths defined by contemporary modal philosophy, like Kripke.
Exactly. And our mission here for you listening is really to extract the core arguments, which are often conflicting, right? Arguments for political and ethical stability.
We want to challenge some conventional wisdom, maybe, on subjects like leadership or truth or even the nature of the self.
Ultimately, we're seeking to understand what truly binds a successful society together. And maybe more fundamentally, what defines a conscious person.
So let's unpack this. Okay, part one. Let's start with the state, the foundations of political stability. Security versus justice. We begin with the state and that essential question of political survival. If you're a leader, especially a new leader, how do you ensure your project actually endures?
Right.
For Machiavelli, writing in The Prince, the calculus is, well, it's cold and immediate. Security and power aren't just goals. They're the necessary prerequisites for everything else.
Absolutely. And he's acutely aware of how difficult that challenge is. Machiavelli really stresses that maintaining a newly acquired principality is inherently much, much harder than holding on to a hereditary state.
Why is that exactly?
Well, because new principalities are just ripe for rebellion,
Sure.
The moment you take over, you've disrupted ancient customs. You've made enemies of those you kicked out.
Yeah.
And even the people who supported you might quickly become unhappy with, the rewards they get or don't get.
So the memory of the old regime is the immediate danger zone.
Precisely. You see this historically, like the examples given, the rebellions against the Romans in Spain, France, Greece. Machiavelli points out these only really stopped once the memory of the former rulers was totally extinguished.
Just worn down by time and empire.
Yeah, by the long continuance of the empire, as he puts it. It takes time, it takes power, and let's be honest, probably a degree of harshness to erase that collective memory.
And that constant pressure means the new prince is living under a microscope, doesn't it?
Totally. Every single action is watched much more closely than that of an established hereditary ruler. But Machiavelli notes, this can actually work to the prince's advantage.
How so?
Well, if his actions are seen to be able, courageous, competent, he can actually bind people to him more tightly through that observed strength than mere ancient blood ever could. Loyalty earned, not just inherited.
Okay, but to achieve that competence, he's got to choose his methods and resources very carefully.
Yes.
And this brings us to Machiavelli's famous and deeply pragmatic argument against relying on external forces, specifically mercenaries and auxiliaries.
This is such a core insight into military dependence, isn't it? He makes this stunning distinction between the specific dangers these two groups pose.
Let's break that down. Mercenaries first.
Okay, so mercenaries, they're purely hired guns.
Yeah.
Their danger, Machiavelli says, is their dastardly, their cowardice, their lack of unified loyalty when things get really tough. If they lose...
You're ruined. Simple as that.
Exactly. You're ruined.
That makes a certain kind of intuitive sense. But the danger of auxiliaries, these are troops loaned to you by a more powerful ally. That seems more insidious the way he describes it.
It is far more insidious. Machiavelli states their danger is their valor, their competence. If they're good soldiers...
They might win too well.
Precisely. You're relying on a force that is united, disciplined, obedient, great qualities, right? But they're obedient to someone else. So if they succeed in saving you, you are now dependent on them. And they are perfectly positioned right there on your soil to potentially conquer you in the very act of saving you. You've basically invited a dominant power in.
It's the ultimate strategic trap. The competence you needed becomes the very thing that enslaves you.
Yes, and we see this so vividly in that historical example he uses. The Emperor of Constantinople asks for help against his neighbors, brings in 10,000 Turks. They win the war, and then they just refuse to leave. That, Machiavelli notes grimly, was the immediate beginning of Greece's servitude.
Wow. So the ultimate Machiavellian takeaway here is,
Real victory cannot be gained with the arms of others, period. The wise prince must always turn to his own forces. He should prefer to lose with his own troops than to win with foreign aid.
because self-reliance is the only real security.
It's the only path that leaves you truly in command of your own destiny.
And this need for self-reliance, it extends beyond just the military, doesn't it? It goes to the prince's relationship with his own people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
He must secure the friendship of the people. That's crucial for security when adversity hits. And Machiavelli explicitly takes on that old saying, that trite proverb, that he who builds on the people builds on the mud.
He thinks that's wrong, or at least simplistic.
Dangerously oversimplified, yeah. He clarifies, look, that proverb might be true for a private citizen trying to gain popular favor against the powers that be. That can be fickle.
Okay.
But for a prince, a courageous leader who can command, who's resolute, who keeps the people encouraged and hopeful, the people are bedrock, not mud.
So when adversity hits, like invasion or conspiracy,
The prince has to rely on the populace for his defense against rivals. And if he is consistently given a good example of strong leadership, their loyalty will be his shield. He can't afford to alienate them.
okay, so stability for Machiavelli is this highly calculated, pragmatic, immediate thing. It's rooted in physical security, self-reliance, and carefully cultivated popular loyalty.
That sums it up well.
But that brings us to this radical pivot. We shift gears completely to John Rawls, who essentially argues that prioritizing that kind of pragmatic security over fundamental principles is the very definition of a failed or at least an unjust state.
Right. We move from the realm of, let's say, expedience to the realm of the ideal. Rawls, in his theory of justice as fairness, asserts this absolutely uncompromising principle. Justice is the first virtue of human activities.
The first virtue.
The first, meaning that rights secured by justice are simply not subject to political bargaining. They're not subject to the calculus of social interests. And this is his fundamental break, really, with utilitarianism.
Explain that break. A utilitarian might argue.
A utilitarian, if they could somehow prove, mathematically maybe, that sacrificing the rights of a small minority would lead to the greatest overall happiness for the vast majority.
They'd have to do it.
Right.
Morally obligated.
They'd have a moral obligation to make that sacrifice. Rawls just flatly rejects that. He states very clearly, any injustice is tolerable only if it is absolutely necessary to avoid an even greater injustice. It's a very high bar.
So to understand why he thinks this uncompromising virtue is so necessary, we first have to get his view of society itself.
Exactly. He describes society as a cooperative venture for mutual advantage, which sounds nice, right?
Yeah, positive spin.
But it has two sides. There's an identity of interest we all do better cooperating than living alone. But there's also an inherent, unavoidable conflict of interests.
Over what?
Over how to distribute the greater benefits that cooperation produces, who gets what share of the pie.
And this conflict is why we need principles of social justice.
Precisely. And those principles, Rawls insists, must apply primarily to the basic structure of society.
Why the basic structure? The political constitution, the economic system. Why start there rather than, say, individual actions or transactions?
Because the basic structure creates what Rawls calls deep inequalities. These inequalities fundamentally shape a person's life expectations from the moment they're born.
Things like socioeconomic background, political privilege, access to education, healthcare.
All of that. These inequalities are so fundamental, so pervasive, and often so arbitrary from the individual's point of view that they can't possibly be justified by just saying someone deserves their starting position based on merit.
Because you haven't done anything yet to deserve it or not deserve it.
Right. Since these inequalities profoundly affect our entire life's trajectory, the principles of justice have to apply there first to regulate them fairly.
Okay, and the centerpiece of this regulatory system is what he calls the priority of the right over the good. What does that mean practically?
It means that moral boundaries, principles of right and justice, must be placed on the design of our institutions from the very beginning. Institutions cannot be designed in ways that encourage or generate desires or tendencies that contradict those fundamental principles of justice.
So you can't design a system, say, that maximizes economic output if doing so requires creating a permanent underclass with no political voice.
Exactly. This is crucial because it prevents the state from basing its legitimacy on what he calls the contingencies of human life, meaning whatever desires happen to be most popular or seem most efficient at any given moment. Utilitarianism relies entirely on calculating those contingent desires.
Whereas Rawls says,
Rawls argues that the principles of right place firm, non-negotiable limits on what kinds of desires or goods the state is even allowed to pursue. Liberty and fairness come before any calculation of aggregate happiness or efficiency.
this brings us to the structure of his two famous principles of justice, which are organized, you said, in a serial or lexical order, like a dictionary.
A lexical, yes, like words in a dictionary. The first principle must be fully satisfied before you can even consider the second one.
And the first principle is?
The principle of equal basic liberties. This covers the fundamentals. Political liberty. Voting, holding office, freedom of speech and assembly, freedom of conscience and thought, the right to hold personal property, freedom from arbitrary arrest, the classic liberal freedoms. These must be equal for everyone.
Okay, absolutely primary. And the second principle, which only comes into play once the first is secured.
The second principle regulates economic and social inequalities. It has two parts. First, inequalities are only permissible if they are attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality of opportunity.
So no discrimination, real access for everyone.
Right. And second, this is the crucial part. Any existing inequalities must satisfy the lexical difference principle.
The difference principle, what's that?
It means that social and economic inequalities must be arranged so that they are to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. You structure the system to maximize the prospects of the worst-off representative person.
Wow. So not just equal opportunity, but the outcome itself has to be structured to lift the bottom.
Yes. Inequalities are only justified if they work to make the people at the bottom better off than they would be under a system of perfect equality.
So putting it together, there's an absolute priority. No one can trade away their basic political liberties, say, for the promise of greater economic prosperity for the average person.
Correct. You can't tell someone, look, we're going to restrict your right to protest, but don't worry, the GDP will go up and maybe some of that will trickle down. Rawls says that kind of trade-off is structurally prohibited by the lexical order.
It's an absolute uncompromising structure. It feels kind of rigid, maybe immoderate, compared to how politics usually works through compromise.
It does feel rigid, but Rawls argues this rigidity is precisely what's necessary. It ensures that those basic liberties are definite, secure, and immune for the temptations of political expediency or bargaining based on social interests. It prevents the very institutional flaws that could lead to systemic injustice down the line.
Okay, now we need to try and connect these two massive and seemingly opposed ideas. We've got Machiavelli's stability based on security and power versus Rawls' stability based on justice and rational commitment. How does the calculation of power align, or maybe more accurately, clash with the priority of justice?
Well, they clash pretty fundamentally on their source of legitimacy, don't they? Machiavelli is seeking de facto stability, what actually keeps the government physically running and safe from immediate overthrow. What works right now?
Practical reality.
Practical reality. Rawls is seeking de jure stability, what makes the citizens rationally want to support the system because they recognize it as fundamentally fair.
Okay.
And for Rawls, that rational willingness requires something he calls congruence.
Congruence between what?
Between the principles of justice themselves and the citizen's own conception of their good, their desire to act justly. Remember, the original agreement in his thought experiment is final, made in perpetuity.
Right, behind the veil of ignorance.
Exactly. So the parties choosing the principles have to be sure they can actually live up to them. Even in the worst possible circumstances they might find themselves in, they have to withstand the strains of commitment.
So a system is truly stable only if?
Only if it generates its own support over time through its visible fairness. People see it's just, they develop trust, and they willingly uphold it. It removes that sort of generalized prisoner's dilemma where individual self-interest might tempt people to break the rules if they think they can get away with it.
That makes sense in theory, but stability isn't just a passive thing, right? Even in a system that aims to be just, or is nearly just, as Rawls puts it, the real test comes when maybe the institutions are generally okay, but serious violations of justice still happen. How does the stable state, the Rawlsian state, handle something like civil disobedience?
Yeah, that's a critical tension. In a reasonably just democratic regime, you have this conflict. The duty to comply with laws enacted by a legitimate procedure.
Even flawed laws.
Even flawed laws, yes. And the duty to oppose profound injustice when it occurs. Rawls argues that citizens in a nearly just state do have a natural duty to support just institutions. So there's a presumption in favor of complying with the law.
But that can't be absolute for an autonomous citizen, can it? You can't just outsource your conscience to the state.
Precisely. Well, the state provides the public interpretation of justice. And often, it's better that the law is settled than that it's settled perfectly rightly. The ultimate burden of judgment rests with the individual.
So what's the conclusion?
Rawls concludes that ultimately, each person must indeed make his own decision about whether civil disobedience is justified in a particular case. The decision to break the law, importantly, peacefully, publicly, nonviolently, and accepting the legal consequences, is the individual citizen's final appeal to the shared sense of justice of the majority.
Okay. So, in part one, we've set up these two really different blueprints for the state. Machiavelli demanding immediate physical stability rooted in present power and perception, and Rawls demanding long-term institutional stability rooted in an eternal, rational commitment to liberty and fairness for all, especially the least well-off.
A stark contrast.
Definitely. Now let's shift perspective and move inward to the architecture of the self. All right, part two. We're shifting now from the political realm to ancient and modern metaphysics, from the stable state to the stable self. If the goal is personal tranquility, how do you build a mind, a soul that can withstand the chaos of the world?
And for that, we turn first to Epicurus, writing way back in the ancient world. He provided this rigorous, almost scientific materialist solution centered on achieving ataraxia.
Ataraxia, freedom from mental disturbance.
Exactly. Freedom from fear, anxiety, turmoil. Epicurus was an intellectual heir to Democritus, the atomist. He was a deep naturalist. His whole system, physics and ethics, is built on the idea that we can figure out truth and the good using three basic criteria.
Okay, what are the three criteria?
Sensations, preconceptions, and feelings, specifically pleasure and pain.
Let's take those one by one. Sensations first.
He insisted, quite radically perhaps, that all sensations are true. They are direct, immediate, infallible reports of atomic impressions hitting our senses.
So if I see a tower that looks round from far away, but it's actually square up close.
The sensation of round tower from afar is true. That's what your senses accurately reported given the conditions. The error only comes later when your mind makes a judgment or forms an opinion that the tower itself is round without getting closer to verify.
Okay, so sensations are like raw, infallible data. Interpretation is where error creeps in. What about preconceptions?
Preconceptions, or prolapsis in Greek, are general concepts. Think man, justice, goodness. These are formed naturally in the mind from the repeated input of those true sensations. They're like mental templates necessary for thinking, reasoning, and philosophical discussion.
And the third criterion, feelings of pleasure and pain.
These are the ultimate guides for choice and avoidance. They are criteria of truth because, like sensations, they are immediate, undeniable impressions of our bodily and mental states. We just know pleasure is good to pursue and pain is bad to avoid.
This leads us right to his ethical goal, doesn't it? Defining the highest good. And this is where the popular image of Epicureanism often goes wrong.
Completely wrong. We think Epicurean means indulging in fancy food, drink, luxury, chasing intense physical thrills.
Hedonism in the modern sense?
Right, but that's the opposite of what Epicurus taught. The highest good for him isn't kinetic pleasure, the active enjoyment, the titillation of the senses.
Yeah.
It's katastomatic pleasure, which is a static, stable state. It's the complete absence of all pain and distress. He breaks it down into aponia, the absence of bodily pain, and ataraxia, the absence of mental disturbance. That is the highest, most stable pleasure.
So happiness is basically a state of equilibrium. A process of subtraction, maybe, rather than addition.
Exactly. You achieve it not by chasing luxuries and intense experiences, which often bring their own anxieties and pains.
Like hangovers or debt.
Or fear of loss, yeah. You achieve it through sober reasoning, as he puts it. Reasoning that carefully seeks out the causes of why we choose certain things and avoid others. It's a philosophical discipline aimed at minimizing disturbance.
And a huge source of disturbance, especially in the ancient world, was fear of the gods. How did Epicurus deal with that?
He addresses it head-on with his theological reduction. He argues, look, the gods must exist. We have this universal preconception of them, this shared idea.
Okay.
But our knowledge of them is also evident in another way. They must be blessed and immortal. That's part of the core concept. Now, what does blessed mean? It means perfectly happy, free from distress.
And things like anger, vengeance, meddling in human affairs.
Those are all signs of disturbance, inconsistency, neediness. They're totally inconsistent with perfect blessedness. Therefore, the gods, being blessed and immortal, cannot be concerned with us. They don't get angry, they don't intervene, they don't reward or punish.
So the fear of divine wrath is just misplaced, based on a misunderstanding of divinity.
Precisely. He says the truly impious person isn't the one who denies the popular gods, but the one who attaches the fearful, mistaken opinions of the masses to the gods. By showing the gods are detached, he removes a massive source of anxiety from human life. The cosmos isn't run by angry, capricious beings.
Okay, that tackles fear of the gods, but if you conquer that, you still face the biggest fear of all, death.
The ultimate disturbance.
How does Epicurus offer therapy for that? His argument is quite famous, isn't it?
It is, and it's rooted entirely in his definition of value, which comes from sentience. His logic is very precise, almost stark. If all good and bad depend entirely on our capacity to feel, on sentience.
Pleasure and pain.
Right, and if all sentience is completely annihilated at the moment of death, then death literally means nothing to me, the person who dies. Because while I am alive, death is not present. And when death is present, I am no longer sentient, I'm not there to experience it. Therefore, death itself cannot be experienced. And anything that cannot be experienced cannot possibly be bad for the one who dies.
So the fear we feel is irrational. It's not about the state of being dead, but about our thoughts about dying.
Exactly. The negative feelings come entirely from our fearful thoughts and projections, imagining our current conscious self somehow persisting into a state of non-existence and finding it unpleasant. But that projection is illogical, according to Epicurus. It's a powerful, if perhaps cold, piece of reasoning designed purely to eliminate fear.
This atomic materialism, though, where everything is just atoms and void, it raises a big question about free will and responsibility, doesn't it? If everything follows necessary physical laws.
Where does our freedom fit in? Yeah, that's a crucial point. Epicurus actively defended freedom against the kind of strict necessity or determinism that was often attributed to his predecessors, like Democritus.
How did he carve out space for freedom in what seems like a deterministic, materialist universe? Did he invoke the famous swerve of the atoms?
The swerve is mentioned in some later sources, yeah, as a way to introduce indeterminacy at the atomic level. But the more philosophical argument, I think, is about the development of the mind itself. He argued that while the particular atoms you're born with might give you certain innate tendencies or dispositions.
Your temperament, things like that.
Right. But the developing mind, especially when refined through reason and philosophical training, becomes, in a sense, the cause of itself. We develop the capacity to reflect, to modify our character, to train our desires, and consciously choose the philosophical path that leads to tranquility.
So we're not just puppets of our atoms, we gain agency through reason.
We gain agency through the complex structure and functioning of the mind itself, which is a physical thing but develops its own internal causal power. We are responsible for how our character develops, even if the raw materials were given.
This philosophical training, this path to tranquility, often seems to involve friendship and Epicurean thought. But that brings up a famously tricky point in his ethics, doesn't it?
Oh, definitely. The value of friendship. Is it purely instrumental? Is it just a tool for security and mutual help, which ultimately serves my own ataraxia? Or is friendship valued for its own sake, intrinsically?
Because if the highest good is only my own state of painlessness,
then logically, friendship must be purely egoistic, right? I value friends because they provide security, help me when I'm sick, offer pleasant company that reduces my own potential distress. It's a means to my own tranquility.
But that feels, well, it feels kind of cold and calculating. It doesn't quite capture what friendship often feels like.
It really doesn't. And that's why this is such a persistent debate in interpreting Epicurus. Many scholars argue, no, he genuinely valued friendship deeply, perhaps even for its own sake, based on how he lived and wrote about it.
But his core philosophical theory, the strict hedonism focusing on ataraxia, struggled to actually ground that value coherently.
Exactly. It's difficult to square intrinsic value for friendship with a theory where the only intrinsic good is one's own state of pleasure painlessness. Perhaps Epicurus was just willing to follow the evidence of human experience that friendship is incredibly valuable, even if it created some tension within his philosophical system. He prioritized the therapeutic goal, maybe?
That tension, that willingness to hold maybe two slightly conflicting ideas based on experience, that actually leads us quite nicely into David Hume,
Hume.
who took skepticism to a whole new level, applying it not just to the external world, but maybe most disturbingly to the internal self.
Yes, Hume's skepticism about personal identity is arguably one of the most radical ideas we've looked at. He concluded, after intense introspection, that the I, the enduring self, the mind, it's essentially a fictitious identity.
Fictitious? How so?
He says, look inside yourself right now. What do you actually perceive? No. You never catch yourself without a perception. You only ever find heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. You find specific mental states.
But no underlying thing that is having those states.
Never. He argues the self is nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with an inconceivable rapidity and are in a perpetual flux and movement.
So the feeling of continuity, of being the same person day after day, that's
a fiction created by the imagination. Because the perceptions are linked by resemblance and causality in our memory, the imagination mistakenly imposes unity and identity onto this constantly changing stream. There's no persistent soul or substance there.
Just a bundle, a heap of perceptions.
That's the idea. And he admits this is a profoundly unsettling, even lonely conclusion. He says nothing gives us rational grounds to assent to anything beyond what is immediately present to our senses at any given moment.
So I leave the room and come back in.
Strictly speaking, the I that re-enters is literally a new bundle of perceptions. The connection to the I that left is only established by memory and the habit of assuming continuity useful fictions, but fictions nonetheless.
That is a deeply unstable architecture for the self.
Deeply unstable. And it extends to the external world, too. Hume famously described experiencing a forlorn solitude at the end of his philosophical inquiries, realizing he had no ultimate rational justification for believing in the objective persistence of anything beyond his current stream of perceptions. Even the idea of the world itself is just another useful fiction constructed by the mind.
Wow. Okay, so where does this profound skepticism come from? It's rooted in his fundamental theory of knowledge, right? His famous fork.
Exactly. Hume's fork, his sharp distinction between relations of ideas and matters of fact. This is absolutely critical to understanding the limits he places on human reason.
Okay, relations of ideas first.
These are truths like mathematics, geometry, logic, think 2 + 2 = 4, or all bachelors are unmarried. They are intuitively or demonstrably certain. Their truth can be discovered by the mere operation of thought, without needing to check anything in the actual world. And crucially, their opposite implies a logical contradiction.
Okay, certain, but maybe don't tell us much about reality itself.
Right, they're about the relationships between our concepts. Then you have matters of fact.
And these are?
These depend entirely on existence in the world. They are settled only by experience, by observation. The sun will rise tomorrow, fire burns, this bread will nourish me. These are all matters of fact. We believe them strongly, but their opposite is not logically contradictory. We can imagine the sun not rising tomorrow without falling into absurdity.
Okay. And the problem comes when we try to reason about matters of fact that go beyond our immediate senses or memory.
Precisely. That's where the famous problem of induction kicks in. Almost all our reasoning about the world involves assuming that the future will resemble the past.
Which seems reasonable enough.
It seems reasonable, it feels natural, it's how we survive. But Hume asks, what is our rational justification for that assumption? When we predict, say, that striking this match will produce a flame because matches have always done so in the past.
We're making a leap.
We are making a daring advance over experience, as he puts it. We rely on observing a constant conjunction. In the past, seeing flame always follows striking. This constant conjunction creates a habit in our minds so that when we see one event, striking, the mind automatically supplies the idea of the other, flame, and creates a feeling of expectation.
But the core assumption there that nature is uniform, that the future will resemble the past.
That assumption is itself a matter of fact. It's not a relation of ideas. Its opposite isn't contradictory. And we can't justify it based on past experience because that would be circular reasoning, assuming the very thing we're trying to prove.
So we have no logical, rational argument for believing the sun will rise tomorrow.
We have no demonstrative argument for it. We operate based on custom, habit, and a kind of natural instinct. Our confidence in the world's consistency is, philosophically speaking, a leap of faith grounded in our psychology, not in deductive certainty.
This radical limitation of reason's power, I mean, if reason can't even prove the sun will rise, it certainly can't be the primary driver of our actions or morality, can it?
Exactly. This leads directly to his most famous or infamous claim regarding motivation. The impulse to action, Hume argues, never arises from reason alone.
Where does it come from then?
It arises from the prospect of pleasure or pain, which causes a consequent emotion, an aversion, or a propensity. You feel pain, you want it to stop. You anticipate pleasure, you want to achieve it.
And reason's role in this is just
Purely instrumental. Reason can discover the connections between things cause and effect. It can tell you how to get the pleasure or avoid the pain. It finds the means to the end. But the end itself, the desire or aversion, is given by the passions, by emotion.
So reason figures out the path, but passion chooses the destination.
Perfectly put. If the objects themselves are indifferent to us, if they don't spark any feeling of desire or aversion, then reason's cool calculation of how they relate to each other can never actually make us do anything. Reason is, in his famous phrase, and ought only to be the slave of the passions.
Wow. So the stable self, for Hume, if we can even call it that, is built on what? A fleeting bundle of perceptions, guided by emotional habit, connected to the world only by useful, necessary, but ultimately unprovable fictions.
It's a pretty stark picture, isn't it? A stark contrast to the kind of rational self-mastery Epicurus aimed for, or the principled self Rawls requires.
Okay, moving from that deep Humean skepticism, which really questions the foundations of everything, let's turn now to contemporary metaphysics, specifically the logic of necessity viewed through the lens of Saul Kripke.
Right. Kripke offers a powerful toolkit, really, using modal logic, the logic of possibility and necessity, to try and ground concepts like identity and essence in a way that pushes back against both traditional empiricism, like Hume's, and also challenges certain modern materialist views of the mind.
And his intervention starts, surprisingly perhaps, with language itself, with the concept of the rigid designator.
Exactly. This challenges a long-standing view, going back maybe even before Hume, that proper names like Aristotle or London are essentially just shorthand for a definite description.
Explain that difference. What's a rigid designator versus a description?
Okay, so a proper name, like Aristotle, according to Kripke, refers to the very same individual in all possible worlds where that individual exists. Think of possible worlds as hypothetical scenarios, how things could have been different. The name Aristotle picks out that guy. Regardless of what he achieved or didn't achieve in some other possible history, it rigidly designates him.
Okay, and a definite description.
A definite description, like the greatest philosopher of antiquity, might pick out Aristotle in our world, but in another possible world, maybe Plato was considered greater, or maybe someone else entirely. Or maybe in some worlds, no one achieved that title. So the description doesn't rigidly stick to the same object across all possibilities.
Got it. So names point, descriptions describe. How does this seemingly simple linguistic point lead to something as profound as a posteriori necessity? That sounds like a contradiction in terms.
It really does. Traditionally, we think necessary truths, like 2 + 2 = 4, or logical truths, are known a priori before or independent of experience. And empirical discoveries, like water boils at 100 degrees Celsius or my car is red, are contingent. They could have been otherwise, and we know them a posteriori through experience. Kripke argues this neat separation is wrong.
He mixes them up. How?
He argues that some truths we discover empirically, through science or observation, turn out to be necessarily true once discovered. We have to distinguish between epistemic possibility, what we thought might be the case before we knew better, and metaphysical necessity, what must actually be true about the fundamental nature of reality.
Okay, this feels abstract. Give us the classic example he uses.
The classic astronomical identity, Hesperus Phosphorus. Hesperus was the name for the evening star, Phosphorus for the morning star. For a long time, ancient astronomers thought they were two different celestial bodies.
So epistemically, it seemed possible they were different.
Right. Discovering they were both, in fact, the planet Venus was an empirical, a posteriori discovery made through observation. It could have turned out otherwise, from their perspective.
But once that empirical fact was established that both names, Hesperus and Phosphorus, rigidly designate the same object, Venus.
Then, Kripke argues that identity becomes metaphysically necessary. If Hesperus is Phosphorus in the actual world, then in every possible world where Venus exists, Hesperus must be Phosphorus. They couldn't possibly be different objects while still being Venus because both names rigidly pick out that single entity. The identity holds across all possible worlds.
So it's a necessary truth, but one we had to discover through empirical means.
Exactly, a posteriori necessity.
And he argues this applies not just to specific objects like Venus, but also to natural kind terms.
Yes, things like gold, water, tiger. Kripke treats these terms as being analogous to proper names. They function as rigid designators for a certain kind of substance or species with an underlying essential nature.
So once science discovers the underlying nature, say, that water is H2O,
That chemical composition, H2O, is no longer just an accidental property of water. It becomes part of the very definition, the essence, of what it is to be water. We discovered it empirically, a posteriori, through chemistry. But now, we cannot coherently imagine a possible world where a substance is water but isn't H2O. Its chemical structure is essential to its identity.
Okay, that's a powerful idea. How does this connect to the philosophy of mind? This seems like the most significant application of Kripke's logic. He uses it to challenge materialism, right?
He does. Specifically, he challenges the common materialist claim, often called the identity theory or functionalism in various forms, that mental states, like feeling pain, are contingently identical to physical states, like having your C fibers stimulate in a certain way in your brain.
And the materialists often use that water H2O analogy themselves, don't they?
They do. They argue, look, pain equals C fiber stimulation is just like water, H2O. It's an empirical identity discovered by neuroscience. We used to think pain was something spooky or non-physical, but science showed us it's just this brain state. It's contingent, could have been linked to D fibers maybe, but in humans, it happens to be C fibers.
But Kripke says, hold on, that analogy fails. Why?
Because of how we identify or pick out the referent of the term pain compared to how we pick out water or heat.
How is it different?
We don't primarily identify water by its surface properties, liquid, clear, thirst quenching, in a way that's essential. We identify it as that substance, whatever its underlying nature turns out to be, H2O. Same for heat. We identify it as the phenomenon that causes sensations of warmth, whatever its underlying physical cause, molecular motion. But with pain,
We identify it directly by what it feels like.
exactly. We pick out pain by its immediate phenomenological quality, its subjective feel, its hurtfulness. That feeling is the essential property of pain. It's not picked out by its typical causes, like tissue damage, or its typical effects, like saying ouch or withdrawing. The feeling is the essence.
Okay. And if pain is identified by its essential feeling,
Then if pain were identical to a physical state, like C fiber stimulation, that identity would have to be necessary, just like Hesperus is necessarily phosphorus, or water is necessarily H2O. It would have to hold in all possible worlds.
but can we imagine pain without C fiber stimulation or C fiber stimulation without pain?
Kripke argues, yes, we clearly can. We can imagine beings, maybe aliens, maybe future AI, who feel pain but have totally different physical makeups. No C fibers. We can also, perhaps more controversially, imagine philosophical zombies who have C fiber stimulation happening but feel nothing subjectively.
And if we can coherently imagine these possibilities,
Then the identity between the phenomenal feeling of pain and the physical state of C fiber stimulation cannot be necessary. It doesn't hold across all possible worlds. And if the identity isn't necessary, Kripke argues, then it cannot be a true identity at all, in the way that scientific identities like water H2O are necessary. Consciousness, the what it's like aspect, seems to resist this kind of physical reduction because its phenomenal quality is its essence.
that's a powerful objection. It throws a wrench into simple materialism. It forces us to ask deeper questions about consciousness itself, doesn't it?
Absolutely. If phenomenal experience is essential and perhaps irreducible, is consciousness then an all-or-nothing affair? Like Descartes seemed to think, treating animals as mere automata without real feelings. Or is it more like a continuous variable where complexity matters and maybe some creatures have more consciousness than others?
A viable theory needs to address that, which creatures have it and why.
Right. And this connects directly to critiques of strong AI and functionalism. Functionalism is the view that mental states are defined by their causal roles, inputs, outputs, relations to other states, not by the underlying physical stuff. So, theoretically, anything that implements the right program could have mental states.
Which leads to claims like the one mentioned that even simple machines like thermostats can be said to have beliefs.
Which Kripke and others like John Searle find deeply problematic. They argue that intentionality, real understanding, believing, perceiving seems to depend crucially on the specific causal powers of the underlying biological or physical structure. It's not just about running the abstract software.
So the functionalist idea that the brain doesn't matter, only the program does, is flawed. It's a kind of residual dualism.
That's the argument. It separates mind, the program, from body, the hardware, in a way that might ignore the specific capacities of biological systems. We should start, perhaps, with the evident fact that humans have rich conscious experiences and beliefs, and thermostats almost certainly don't, and ask what structural differences account for that rather than assuming structure is irrelevant.
Functionalists sometimes use thought experiments to counter this, like the marry the color scientist argument, the brilliant scientist raised in a black and white room who knows all the physical facts about color but still learns something new, what it's like when she sees red for the first time.
Right, suggesting the phenomenal quality is something over and above the physical or functional description.
But the Kripkean perspective might respond differently.
Well, following the logic, if redness, the experience, is picked out by its essential phenomenal quality, then knowing all the physical facts might implicitly include knowing that quality, even if Mary can't represent it to herself without the right biological apparatus. Or perhaps the functionalist might say Mary simply lacked the full concept of redness before seeing it, because part of the concept involves the ability to have and recognize the experience. It gets very complex, looping back to whether representation itself requires specific physical structures.
It seems like Kripke's arguments force us to take the subjective, phenomenal quality of experience much more seriously as a core metaphysical fact.
I think that's fair to say. It challenges us to explain consciousness without explaining it away.
Okay, finally, let's try to connect these deep metaphysical ideas about self, identity, and experience back to ethics. How does our interior architecture, our intentions, our conscious states determine our moral standing?
We can revisit that medieval debate on moral intention, drawing on someone like William of Ockham. He argued quite forcefully against assigning moral value to the exterior act itself.
So the physical action, walking, talking, giving money, is morally neutral.
According to Ockham, yes, in itself it is. The moral variance, whether an action is ultimately good or evil, arises solely from the underlying interior act. That is, the intention, the will, the reason behind the physical act.
Give us the classic example again.
Walking to church. One person walks to church with the internal act of intending to worship God. That's a good intention, making the overall act good. Another person performs the exact same physical act walking to the same church, but their internal act is purely to be seen by others and appear pious, maybe for social gain. That's a bad intention, vainglory, making the overall act evil.
Even though the external behavior is identical.
Identical. The entire moral weight resides in the intention within the agent's mind.
This places a huge burden and also huge power on the agent's reflective capacity, doesn't it? On the mind's ability to direct itself, to be, as maybe Epicurus hinted, the cause of itself in a moral sense.
Absolutely. Our moral life is played out primarily on the inside.
And cultivating that reflective, intentional inner life might require ways to integrate these different points of ourselves, our feelings, our knowledge, our ethical commitments.
Yes, and the sources mention something like visual wonder or astonishment as potentially serving that integrating function.
How does astonishment work in that way? It seems like an emotion.
It starts as an emotion, yes, but it does more. When you're truly astonished by something, maybe a natural phenomenon, a work of art, a profound idea, it does several things. It triggers an affective response, obviously, but it also forces an epistemic reevaluation.
Makes you stop and think, what is this? How is this possible?
Exactly. It disrupts your normal, habitual Humean flow of perceptions and forces you to confront something unexpected, maybe even something that seems necessary or essential once you grasp it. Connecting back to Kripke. And that process, that questioning, naturally promotes moral reflection too, by cultivating a kind of existential curiosity. Astonishment can make you confront the limits of your own understanding, the contingency of your usual assumptions, maybe the sheer improbability of existence itself. This can push you towards seeking more stable, philosophically grounded answers about who you are and how you should live. It integrates knowing, feeling, and valuing.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a massive amount of ground here. We've gone from the political imperative of stability all the way to the necessary truths of identity and the essence of experience.
It's been quite a journey. We saw that architecture of political security demanded by Machiavelli, grounded in power and pragmatism.
Juxtaposed right against the architecture of justice built by Rawls, demanding uncompromising principles, lexical priorities, and rational long-term commitment.
Then we explored the self. From Epicurus's careful calculus for happiness, minimizing pain to achieve that state of ataraxia.
To Hume's shattering skepticism, leaving us with what? A fictitious self, a bundle of perceptions bound together only by habit and custom, with no certainty about the world beyond our immediate impressions.
And then Kripke brought necessity back into the picture with rigid designators, arguing for necessary truths discovered empirically.
Leading to that profound challenge to materialism, suggesting that consciousness itself, the raw feeling of experience, resists being reduced to mere physical states because its phenomenal quality is its essence.
Yeah.
So we've seen these arguments for political orders based on what seem like eternal, non-negotiable truths, like Rawls' principles, and orders based entirely on practical, time-bound observations of how humans actually behave, like Machiavelli's.
And similarly for knowledge, arguments rooted in necessary identity, like Kripke's water is H2O.
And Hume's deep skepticism, questioning if we can really be certain about anything beyond relations of ideas.
Which brings us back to that central tension, doesn't it? It reminds me of that quote from Schelling, arguing that maybe everything is just a product of its time, that maybe even the eternal truths are nothing but propositions abstracted from their contemporary situation.
That's a provocative thought. So if the core of being human lies somewhere in our intentionality, our capacity for reason, our ability maybe to modify our own character, our interior architecture, how much of the stability we crave, both in our societies and in our own minds, depends on truths that are genuinely timeless and necessary.
And how much depends merely on the enduring consensus, the habits, the language, the useful fictions of our particular time and place.
It really makes you wonder, what kind of philosophical architecture are you listening right now building your life upon? Is it grounded in perceived necessity, pragmatic observation, ethical ideals, or maybe a healthy dose of skepticism?
Something definitely worth pondering.
Indeed. Something to think about until our next deep dive.